Alright, this is the moment you've all been waiting for. This is the actual build. And wow, it was one hell of a build in every sense of the word. So I did kind of cheat a bit, and I did some work off camera. I was too impatient to wait for my clock modules, so I just hacked a battery into the Dallas RTC. It's a common mod. I used a hacksaw to cut in. Some people have used knives or files. I found that the existing battery in there was dead as a doornail, but I cut one lead to isolate it anyway. Oh, and I didn't have a battery holder, so I used a dollar store tea light. So I tested that and it worked. I installed DOS on the Discon module. Also tried the GoTech, which turned out to be super convenient. I love this thing. And I tried SpeedSys. I tested with the Pentium 133, which worked perfectly fine. I also tested with the 233 MMX. And, well, this motherboard completely refused to set the proper multiplier. And the details are in the write-up, but basically the motherboard doesn't assert one of the lines correctly because Intel changed the specification between the classic Pentium and the MMX. Anyway, the VRM gets really hot on either processor, so running an overvolted, overpowered MMX is probably kind of iffy anyway. So if I do upgrade the processor, it'll be to a 200 MHz Pentium MMX overdrive. Those are kind of rare. So anyway, at this point everything works, I got all the parts, so let's build. I decided to mount the motherboard first, which wasn't a terrible decision, but, well, it uses these stupid plastic mounts. There's only two actual standoffs. The idea is that you put the board in and slide it upwards, and they lock in. I'm not sure what the point of that is. Anyway, the left and middle rows of the motherboard in the case matched, except for one hole in the motherboard filled with glue, but the new board is quite a bit shorter than the old one, and the rightmost holes line up with the giant hole in the case. Why is there a giant hole here? I guess it's probably weight reduction, that's probably the real answer, but I'm thinking, well, there's no room for cable management behind it, and this was like 15 years before heatsink backplates were around. So I ended up just adding some rubber feet under the filled-in hole in the motherboard and the right edge to kind of support it a little bit. And it was a beast to get in, but it's mostly secure. I think it's as good as it's gonna get. After that, it was time to mount the I/O. Yeah, there's no such thing as an I/O shield. So originally, everything except the keyboard port was on its own card, but in the late 486 to Pentium era, they moved that functionality onto the motherboard, so you ended up with these little dongles. There's two options for mounting them. You can either put them in slot brackets or use punch-outs that most cases have. I used a mix of both here. I put the serial in punch-out holes and the parallel and PS2 mouse on a bracket, because that's what I had mostly. Now, the pinouts are not truly standardized. Most of them are the same, but not always. So the serial ports I used, I think, are the original ones. I actually swapped a random parallel port on a bracket with one that I'm pretty sure is the original, just to be sure. And the PS2 mouse port, these are wildly varying, so I actually specially modified the one I had to match this motherboard. Fingers crossed. And this is where things started to go downhill. So first I installed the drive cage. You have to take it out to install the motherboard, I figured. I'll put it back in at this point. This one is a bit bent and has a finicky alignment pin, so, you know, I got it in. Hold this thought, because it will become important later that I put the cage back in. Anyway, remembering that the optical and floppy drives go in and out without taking the bezel off, I figured, put the bezel back on. And then I wired up the front panel connections. They're labeled poorly, and I don't have the manual, so that was fun. And installed the fan. Or attempted to install the fan. So your average modern case is typically graced with at least one 120mm fan mount, usually more like two 120s, two 140s, one 200. Here we get one measly 80mm fan mount, with a lot of airflow restricting steel around it. There's a few mounting options, but the best seem to be in front of the metal, behind the bezel. So I screwed the fan in, and the screws are backwards from today's convention. They go through the fan into the frame, just normal case screws, not fan screws that go through the frame into the fan. And then I couldn't get the bezel on. So I don't remember fans being thinner than my modern 80x25 deep cool, but I figured, okay, fine, it's just a shitty design. I'll try one of the other positions on the inside. It's not ideal, there's more blockage with these mounts, but wait, no, these are actually for 60mm fans. The holes don't line up, I could get one screw in, that's it. And then I later thought about it after I was done, and I'm pretty sure these aren't even for fans at all. The ones on the inside's for a card holder, which I don't have, it's long gone. So I ended up just giving up. I put in one screw that's not holding the fan in, so I got some duct tape and kind of taped it in, and it looks fucking terrible, but it's stupid and it works, so it's not stupid, right? So after giving up on trying to mount the fan properly, I did some wiring. I put in the piece of RAM that fell out, and I installed the power supply. The XFX 650 watt didn't fit, so I picked up a brand new Corsair CX450. It was cheap, it was on sale, there was a rebate, and it's a good DC-DC design, so it'll work. So after the power supply was in, I went on to the optical drive, and it turns out that this DVD-RW drive that I'm using, unfortunately the creative drive out of the 486, it's broken. This one's still too new, but it's older than I thought. It's from 2003, not 2009. This old case is missing one thing that I take for granted, kind of, when it comes to mounting optical drives. Yeah. Newer cases have little shelves that hold it in place while you screw it in. Yeah, other than that, it's pretty much the same as a modern case. Not toolless, of course, but otherwise, yeah. Anyway, that was kind of a momentary respite in the shittiness. Installing the floppy drives is kind of impossible in this case. You can't install the drive cage first because the motherboard tray blocks the screw holes on one side. But you can't install the drives first because good luck getting everything lined up well enough to actually slide the cage in. So what I ended up doing was installing the drives loosely into the cage and then pushing it in, wiggling it, pushing it some more, and just constantly worrying that I was going to smash everything around it. Eventually I managed to get it in, and then I tightened the screws on the side I could get to and called it a day. Yeah, that sucked. So I tried to do cable management as I went throughout the whole process. It's very important, of course. Well, there's a few issues. Well, the first is that there's just nowhere to route the cables. This case is about as tall as a modern, small mid-tower, but it's a lot narrower and a lot shorter, so there's no room behind the motherboard tray and no room between the drive cage and the power supply. The cables themselves are big, inflexible, and often barely long enough. There's usually only one way to route a cable. It's not a particularly good one. Naturally, the cable wants to go a certain way, and you can play origami with it, but you risk breaking it. And of course, some of the ports are just in stupid spots, like the IDE ports below the CPU, so I have to route over the damn heatsink. I tried my best, but the end result isn't great. Installing the expansion cards was actually super easy. This was probably the most straightforward part of the entire build. I used the Mach 64, like I'd done in testing, and also the AW64, a sound card that I got off Craigslist, and an Intel network card, which, while not original, was used in this PC at some point. ISA is a little long and annoying. Interestingly, the cards actually face the opposite way than modern ones, like PCI or PCI Express. But, you know, it's pretty much the same. You drop the card in the slot, you screw it in. Predictably, when I tried firing it up, I got nothing. Zilch. Nada. Not a thing. So I went through the usual troubleshooting steps. I stripped it down to the minimum known good configuration and built up from there. I ended up rewiring the front panel thinking I'd screwed it up. I don't think that was actually what was stopping it from booting, but I did spend some time getting all the pretty lights to work, and they weren't before, so I guess that's good. I did narrow it down to something to do with the CD-ROM or the secondary IDE channel where it was hooked up, and after swapping drives, testing them in and out of the case, testing power, different cables, turns out that I just didn't have the cable in the motherboard the right way. So anyway, once I got that fixed, I put the sound and network cards back in, and everything worked. All in all, building PCs has definitely gotten a lot easier over the years. There have been so many improvements to usability we don't even think about, things like keyed connectors, space for cables, those CD-ROM holdy shelfy things, and properly designed fan mounts. Yeah, there's labels on these boards, but there's a serious lack of things like color coding, standardization, or keying that makes it a lot harder for humans to screw up in human ways. As an anecdote, even today's cheap cases have a lot of builder-friendly features. I bought a $40 case once, 40 Canadian, so like 20 US. Yeah, it was really flimsy, it was really cheap, but it had good fan mounts, had plenty of room for cables, it even had non-shitty toolless drive mounts. So this was definitely the hardest build I've ever done that I can recall. I would say even including the mods in the theme builds, things like WebPC, PowerMac i5, even CandyTop. On the other hand, it's probably the most fun build I've had in a long time. It's just because it's so different. It's something new, something different. it sucked, but it was awesome. I don't know how to describe it. Anyway, I was so excited after I got the thing working finally that I just installed Windows 98 and fired it up, tested it without filming it. So I will do a follow-up video showing some of the things that you can do with this machine, how I'm playing games, getting files onto it, etc. But for now, there's the build. If you thought this build was as cool as I thought it was, please like, share, and subscribe. You can check my Twitter for new updates. I've posted some teasers on the next video there already. And as always, see you next time.